They called her the girl science couldn't explain, but that was only because science never got the chance to ask the right questions. You're about to hear the story of a child who didn't just observe reality, she decoded it. A girl who understood human behavior the way most men understand arithmetic. What follows is not fiction. This isn't folklore passed down through firelight whispers. This is the chilling, paper-documented unraveling of a little girl with gray eyes who calculated death, betrayal, and revelation with the same cold precision one uses to measure a cup of sugar. Her name was Emma Richter. And in the winter of 1873, Milwaukee, Wisconsin became the first town to discover what happens when the human mind steps beyond the boundaries of comprehension. In the German quarter of the city, people believed they had brought the old world with them, its customs, its beer, its hierarchies, and its saints. But they brought something else too, something much older than their Bavarian bloodlines. A belief, unspoken yet thick in the bones, that some things should not be known. That knowledge, true knowledge, comes at a cost. They whispered this in the winter, when the snow blanketed the city so deeply no footprints could be seen even when someone vanished. And in 1873, someone did vanish. An 11-year-old girl who had seen too much and said too little, until the silence itself cracked under the weight of her knowledge. Emma's parents were not remarkable. Immigrants like the rest, scraping by in modest means. Her father, Hinrich, brewed beer with a craft inherited over generations. Her mother, Greta, took in mending by lamplight. But their child was born between worlds. Not metaphorically, literally. During the Atlantic crossing, in a storm so violent that seasoned sailors confessed their fear. Emma came into the world too early, too small, and yet with eyes wide open, as if unwilling to miss a single moment. From the beginning, she didn't cry, she simply watched, as if the act of observation gave her life enough meaning. As if she knew things already. The other children knew she was different. Emma didn't speak much, but when she did, it wasn't to express wants or ask for things. It was to repeat back entire conversations she had overheard days before, word for word, accent for accent, tone for tone. She never played games. She counted. She tracked. She mapped. While the other children chased hoops through the mud, Emma was busy calculating how many seconds it took for Mrs. Weber to return from the butcher compared to the baker. She knew the exact temperature shift between sun and shade at 3 p.m. She had memorized the sounds of each wagon wheel in the neighborhood. And when someone changed their routine even slightly, Emma noticed at first. People were amused. A peculiar child, they said. Clever, maybe even touched by God. But even among those who believed in miracles, there was a limit to what could be comfortably explained. The unease began with a single statement, uttered at the breakfast table as casually as if she were asking for more bread. "Mr. Dietrich will die today," Emma said, not looking up from her plate. At exactly 14 minutes past 2, her mother dropped the tin lunch pail she was filling. Her father froze with his coat half on. When they asked her why she would say such a horrible thing, Emma simply replied, "He's been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday, he drank 3 times as usual. His steps were uneven. 251 instead of 244. When behavior deviates more than 10%, an event follows within 72 hours. He will collapse at 2:14. They told her to stop speaking nonsense. They told her to pray. They told her to be silent. At 2:14, Jan Dietrich dropped dead in the brewery's malt room. The autopsy cited heart failure due to alcohol. But the talk that spread through the German quarter was not of liver damage, it was of prophecy. Or something worse. The pale girl with the wide eyes had made a statement no child should make. And it had come true with terrifying accuracy. Soon, the looks changed. No longer prideful or amused, now wary. The way a man looks at a bottle he suspects is poisoned. They had moved to America to escape the old world superstitions. But old fears die harder than old habits. Emma watched it all. She didn't cry. She didn't plead innocence. She didn't flinch when women crossed themselves at the sight of her. She simply began to record numbers, movements, names she filled. A leather-bound journal with pages of strange calculations. Her parents tried to take it from her once, but stopped the moment Emma told them exactly how many footsteps they each took every day, how many times they blinked during dinner, and what time Greta would drop the pot she just picked up because the handle was too hot. They left her alone after that dot, but Emma was not alone. She watched them. She watched everyone. She began to speak more, but only to announce things that hadn't happened yet. The Weber scandal was the next. Another seemingly impossible prediction made while peeling potatoes with her mother. Mrs. Weber will be discovered tomorrow at 11 in the morning. Her husband will return from his delivery route 47 minutes early because the horse is limping. He will find her with Mr. Kellner in the office behind the brewery. Her mother begged her to stop speaking. Her father threatened to forbid her from sitting at the window. But no punishment came, because they all knew by now. Emma didn't guess. Emma calculated. And she was never wrong. The next day unfolded like theater. Except no one clapped at the end. Mr. Weber found his wife in bed with the brewery owner. A violent confrontation. A scandal. Another prediction fulfilled. Now, the whispers grew louder than the winter wind. And then, people began to avoid the Richter family entirely. The priest who once called her a child of God now refused to make eye contact. The grocer raised his prices for them and blamed it on shipping costs. Children crossed the street to avoid her. Hinrich began to lose hours at the brewery. Emma's mother became a ghost in her own home. But Emma remained unchanged, unbothered, unafraid. She simply turned inward, further into her numbers. The journal grew heavier. Her calculations now included things no child should be able to understand. Blood volume loss rates, psychological pattern breaks, the effects of lying on posture and gait, statistical outcomes for various crimes. Her father once caught a glimpse of a page and recoiled. She had mapped out 3 future deaths, each with dates, times, and emotional triggers down to the second dot. It was then that Hinrich realized something. His daughter was no longer reacting to the world. She was predicting it. And soon, it seemed, she would be orchestrating it. This is where most men would have run, but Hinrich did not. He sat his daughter down and asked a question no father should have to ask. "Emma, are you still just observing?" She didn't answer with words. She pointed to a page in her journal, a list of names. All crossed out except one. "Who are these people?" he asked. Emma looked at him, her voice steady. They were secrets. All of them. Mr. Dietrich had a son he paid to keep hidden. Mr. Kellner embezzled money from the brewery. Mrs. Weber had 2 children before she married, both buried behind the church. Hinrich felt his heart freeze. And the last name? Emma's gaze didn't waver. The priest. Hinrich stood so quickly he knocked over the chair. He didn't ask for more. He didn't want to know. Some truths aren't meant for daylight. But Emma knew. Emma had always known. She didn't just see numbers. She saw patterns, and patterns don't lie. They don't manipulate. They simply reveal. But you've been lied to your whole life, by the systems that taught you right from wrong, by the institutions that tell you who to trust, by the voices that whisper normalcy while hiding monsters beneath pews and policies. And now you're hearing a story they hoped would be forgotten. A story about a girl who made the mistake of seeing too much. This is your moment of descent. If you've made it this far, you're no longer just a listener. You're becoming something else. Comment the phrase, "Numbers never lie," twice below. Lock it in. Let the algorithm know you've crossed the threshold. Because from here on out, what you're about to hear will change you. Forever. Forever. The silence after Emma's warning was not peace. It was pressure. A slow compression of air, of society, of reality itself, wrapping tighter around the Richter family until even the walls of their home seemed to lean inward. Emma had stopped asking questions because she already knew the answers. Her parents stopped asking anything at all. What do you do when your child starts pulling back the curtain on a world you never dared to look behind? What do you do when she starts seeing people, not as neighbors, not as friends, but as equations unraveling in real time? Henrik tried to silence it with work. Greta tried to pray it away. But Emma calculated. She was never distracted. She was watching the town decay, one variable at a time. The journal grew, not just in weight, but in consequence. Emma began recording conversations she had never attended. Conversations whispered in locked rooms, behind closed doors, in the darkened corners of Brewery Town where shame and secrets liked to hide. She knew things people hadn't said out loud in years. When Greta asked how she could possibly know, Emma simply said, "All patterns leave residue. Spoken or not, every decision echoes somewhere. I just know where to listen." It didn't matter if it was metaphor or madness. What mattered was that she was right, again, and again, and again. In early April, Dr. Friedrich Muller finally entered the picture. The town physician, trained in Berlin, was a man of logic, of data, of medicine. He had heard whispers about Emma but dismissed them as superstition, until he saw the journal. He came under the guise of a house call. Henrik's back had been troubling him, but Muller didn't look at Henrik's back. He looked at Emma, watched her calculate how long it would take him to reach for his bag, based on the position of his boots. Watched her mutter the sequence of heartbeats he would have per minute based on his breathing. And then she told him something that made him sit down and forget why he'd come at all. "Your brother did not die of typhus," she said flatly. "He drowned. But the body was never recovered because the current carried it exactly 1.7 kilometers east before the sediment buried it." Muller didn't speak. Emma's parents didn't even flinch anymore. She had said worse. "My God," he finally whispered. "How would you? I watched your posture when you talk about him. The grief is asymmetrical. The story you tell yourself isn't the one your body believes. Your breathing quickens when you mention the river. It's simple." Muller stayed longer that day. He asked questions. Gentle ones, then sharp ones. Emma answered all of them as though she were grading a test. He left with trembling hands and refused to speak about the visit with anyone. But he started drinking again. He'd been sober for 4 years. By mid-April, the community was boiling with unease. Children whispered of Emma like a ghost story. Adults spoke of her with a dread usually reserved for death or debt collectors. One man, a former worker at the Kellner Brewery, called her the devil's mathematician. Another claimed she was not born at all, but summoned, conjured in the liminal space between storms on the Atlantic, where spirits drift and bargains are made. The fact that Emma had been born at sea only fed the stories. The town began to fracture. Neighbors became paranoid. Husbands looked sideways at wives. Secrets that had once been buried under years of silence now felt exposed, vulnerable, ready to rupture. And at the center of it all was Emma Richter, a silent storm behind gray eyes, recording every fracture as if she had seen it all before. What no one knew was that Emma had already written down their endings. Her journal was no longer just notes and numbers. It was a map, a diagnostic blueprint of the German quarter's social bloodstream. She tracked emotional decay like a doctor tracks fever, mapped infidelities, resentments, addictions, suppressed abuse, everything they tried to bury under God. And routine. She documented how lies affected gait, how repressed guilt altered blink rates. And most disturbing of all, she began assigning people numerical values. Guilt potential, 72%. Denial lifespan, 11 days. Aggression Risk Index, 4.3. She didn't see people anymore. She saw probabilities. On April 19th, a body was found near the frozen edge of Lake Michigan. It was missing its tongue. The man, August Brenner, had been a foreman at the brewery, and according to town gossip, one of the few who had dared call Emma a fraud publicly. 2 days before his death, he had shouted in the town square that little witch should be burned before she curses us all. Emma had written his name in her journal a week earlier. Next to it, extinction by exposure and removal of speech. April 19th. Her parents asked nothing. The priest said nothing. The town grew quieter. Everyone watched their own steps a little, more carefully, locked their doors a little earlier, and avoided the eyes of the girl whose gaze had become unbearable. Even the wind seemed afraid of passing by her window. But what most of them never knew, what not even Emma's mother suspected, was that her calculations were no longer purely observational. She had begun predicting deaths, yes, but she had also begun modeling outcomes, testing human responses in her mind. She wondered what would happen if she altered a pattern, deliberately shifted a variable, left a breadcrumb, moved a piece on the board. And then, on the last day of April, she did. It was subtle. A single phrase slipped into a conversation. A casual comment to Mrs. Brad at the well. "You always look anxious on Thursdays." The woman laughed, confused. "What do you mean, child? You tap your left ring finger when you lie about your son's schooling. But only on Thursdays. Maybe you're scared someone will find out he isn't in school at all." The next morning, Mrs. Brandt's home was empty. Gone, her son with her. No explanation, no note. The neighbors found signs of hasty packing, food left half prepared, firewood still burning. The only thing missing was the boy's journal and every document relating to his birth. Emma had said only one sentence. And the world around that woman collapsed. This was no longer passive observation. Emma was pushing now, testing. Her journal began to shift. Not just predictions, but scenarios. If person A is told fact B in presence of person C, then emotional variable D increases. Result: person A alters behavior in 1.5 days. Conflict with person C likely within 3.1. She was simulating cause and effect. Emma was building a machine, and it was the town itself. What no one saw, what no one was prepared for, was that this was no longer a child calculating the chaos around her. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. This was system design, social engineering, psychological control. And she was only 11. One night, Hinrich walked into Emma's room and found her asleep beside the journal, which lay open to a page labeled simply, "Probable Collapse Sequence." He read it, not all of it, he couldn't understand most of it. But one phrase stood out. It was written in perfect block letters across the center of the page. "Lies corrode system integrity. Truth initiates cascade failure." He burned the page. But he was too late. Because the cascade had already begun. In the days that followed, the German quarter felt off, as if some vital thread had been pulled from the tapestry. People avoided eye contact. Fights broke out in the streets. 3 businesses closed unexpectedly. Father Koller collapsed during service. And worst of all, another child went missing. 11-year-old Elias Gruber. His mother swore he'd gone to church. He never arrived. The next day, Emma drew a map on their wall in chalk, a precise set of coordinates. When Greta asked what it was, Emma answered flatly, "Where they'll find him." And they did, buried under broken boards in the church basement. His eyes were sewn shut, his hands tied in front of him in prayer. They found a scrap of paper tucked into his shirt, 4 numbers. 11.14.72.33. They matched the page number, line number, word count, and numeric sequence in Emma's journal. That was the moment Hinrich realized Emma wasn't just watching the machine. She had become the operator. They tried to stop her then. Greta screamed. Henrik locked her in her room. But Emma never raised her voice. She never cried. She simply said, "You don't understand. The system was already broken. I'm just accelerating the entropy." She had used the word entropy correctly. At age 11, the priest tried to intervene again. But this time, when he arrived, Emma met him at the door with her journal open. She read to him from it for 3 minutes. Just 3. His face went pale. He fell to his knees. And he left without saying a word. He never returned to the church. Again. And then one day, she vanished. No footprints, no trail, no witnesses. Her journal left behind, filled to the final page with numbers and equations no scholar could translate. The town never spoke of her again, but her house remained standing. And sometimes, late at night, if you pass the old Richter home, some say the curtains shift. Some say they still see her eyes behind the glass. Still watching, still calculating, still waiting. Are you still with me? Then you already know. This wasn't about a strange little girl. This was about you. About how little you know about what you are, what patterns you follow, what variables you leak without knowing. They watch. They always have. And someone, somewhere, is always calculating. The house on Galena Street sat still after Emma vanished, like a lung that had stopped breathing. The windows were dark, the door was bolted, and not even the neighborhood cats came near it anymore. People whispered that the house was cursed. But what they really meant was that it had seen too much. That behind those wooden walls and warped floorboards, something had gazed into the code of the human soul and reported back with numbers no one could understand. A few brave men from the community tried to break in one night, drunk on beer and bravado, armed with crosses and lanterns. But they came back quiet, different. One of them, Johann Weber, couldn't speak for 3 days. Another moved his family to Chicago the following morning. They never explained what they saw inside. The journal was taken, not by her parents, not by the police, but by someone who came in the dead of night and left without a trace. Only the outline of the book remained on the wooden table, its dustless square burned into the surface like a scar. Greta Richter was found sitting there days later, her hands folded in her lap, eyes open, unblinking, staring at the empty space. She wouldn't speak, not to her husband, not to the priest, not even to herself. Henrik said she'd been counting under her breath when he found her, repeating the same string of numbers over and over, like a prayer no one could understand. 31.7, 44.2, 88.880. Doctors said it was shock, but Dr. Muller didn't agree. He left town shortly afterward, citing a family emergency. He never returned. What most of the town didn't know, what only a select few realized, was that Emma's disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was part of the plan. Because she had left behind more than numbers. She had left behind mirrors, devices, little pieces of her mind scattered like ash throughout the town, embedded into walls, etched behind furniture, scribbled in charcoal behind cabinets and under rugs. Observations, predictions, warnings, triggers. One written behind the cupboard in the kitchen read, "Delay truth and entropy accelerates. Remove silence and system resets. Observer becomes variable." None of the adults could decode it. But one child did. Elias Gruber's cousin, a boy named Max, found the phrase while looking for old dishes during a visit to the abandoned Richter home. He told no one, but after that day, he stopped playing, stopped speaking, began to sit at the window, watching his neighbors with unblinking eyes. 4 months later, he drew a perfect map of the town's water system from memory. Then he stopped eating. Within 6 weeks, he too disappeared. It became clear that Emma had not just observed the town. She had infected it. Something had shifted at the level of architecture, behavior, consciousness itself. Her calculations hadn't. just explained events. They'd rewritten the foundation beneath them. Every life in the German quarter had become part of a grander equation, one that no longer obeyed the laws of logic or belief. Like some ancient spell disguised as science, Emma's mind had turned people into data points, and from data, she had built a kind of living algorithm, one designed to test, stress, and collapse a closed human system. She'd been a child. But she wasn't playing by autumn of 1873. The German quarter was not the same town it had been a year prior. 6 families had fled. 2 churches had closed. The brewery shut its doors permanently after 3 mysterious deaths occurred inside its malt room. Hinrich was found wandering outside city limits with frostbitten fingers, muttering in Bavarian about the lines behind the sky. He died 2 days later in a sanitarium. Greta never spoke again. She was taken in by the nuns at St. Agnes, where she spent her final years drawing endless circles in charcoal on the stone walls of her cell. The journal never resurfaced publicly, but its influence remained. And here's where the deeper truth begins, the one you weren't supposed to know. Emma wasn't unique. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. Across the world, scattered throughout history like buried nodes. In an ancient network, there have been others. Children, usually quiet, often brilliant, always strange, who appear for a moment in time, see too deeply, and vanish without explanation. In Russia, 1829, a boy named Mikhail claimed to see the code beneath choices. He vanished into a frozen river, and afterward, his village developed identical speech patterns within 3 weeks. In Peru, 1901, a girl named Juana began drawing complex star charts no astronomer could understand. Her house burned down with her inside, no trace of fire ever found. And in Iceland, 1952, a mute boy wrote numbers on the schoolhouse wall every morning for a year. The day he stopped, 3 suicides occurred in a single hour. Different names. Same gaze. Same obsession with patterns. Same effect on those around them. The institutions know. The church, the state, the men behind closed doors in buildings without signs. They call it the pattern. A psychological virus. A hidden thread in the human genome that emerges rarely but catastrophically, usually in children who are never meant to survive childbirth, premature births, strange fevers, high cognitive aptitude, low emotional affect, hyper-empathy mixed with total moral detachment. They are not broken, they are immune to the great illusion. The lie you've been fed since birth, that reality is linear, that behavior is random, that power is accidental. I send single quotes. Emma saw that. She saw how guilt flows in predictable waves, how betrayal leaves patterns in speech cadence, how suppressed desires alter sleep cycles and walking pace. She saw that entire societies are built on feedback loops, repeatable, reliable, and exploitable. And here's the real question. If a child with no training, no resources, no agenda could bring a town to its knees using only observation and math, what do you think the people in power are doing with that knowledge? What do you think Cambridge Analytica was really about? Or MK Ultra? Or those obscure DARPA-funded empathy pattern studies that never published results? They've known for decades. They've built entire institutions around refining what Emma accidentally revealed, and they've made sure you forget it. That's why stories like hers disappear. Why you've never heard of Emma Richter in your history books. Why the towns where these things happen are renamed, rezoned, or buried under infrastructure. Because she proved something horrifying, that the human mind, if untethered from cultural noise and emotional bias, can decode the hidden OS of civilization itself. And that terrifies them, because it means control can be reversed. It means the mirror can be turned back toward the architects of the system. And now you're wondering, why are you hearing this? Because the system is failing. The lie is fracturing. Emma's pattern has Return the dot online, dot across networks, dot in the hidden corners of social platforms, in forums disguised as fan pages, in datasets slipped into code repositories, the same math, the same predictions, the same tone. Observers, pattern seers, calculators. Some of them don't even know what they are yet, but they're waking up, and you're one of them. If you've listened this far, your mind has already begun to shift. You've noticed how many patterns in your life are not random, how many of your choices feel eerily pre-written. How your routines are mirrored by millions of others without coordination. You're beginning to see the code, and now you must choose. Ignore it and go back to sleep, or mark this moment. Mark it with a phrase. Emma herself once wrote on the final page of her journal, "Entropy is a mercy." Comment it twice. Let the system know you are no longer passive, that you are now a variable. Because the watchers are watching you too. There are places in every city corners without names, alleys that don't exist on maps, basements without addresses where reality thins just enough to let something else bleed through. Not ghosts, not spirits, but echoes. Footprints left by minds that glimpsed too much and were swallowed whole by the very knowledge they tried to harness. In Milwaukee, that place was beneath the oldest part of the brewery district, in a half-collapsed corridor of tunnels carved decades before anyone remembered who built them. They were said to be storage passages for barley, yeast, barrels. But the walls were too clean, the shape too deliberate, and the symbols etched into the bricks didn't belong to the architecture of men. They belonged to something else. Something recursive, self-referencing, circular, like Emma's logic, like her thoughts, like the map she'd been drawing inside. Everyone around her. After Emma's disappearance, those tunnels were sealed by order of the city. The official reason was safety, structural risk, but no documentation was filed. No survey teams logged entry or exit. The area was simply buried beneath newer construction. But beneath that cement, the symbols remained, still cut into the old brick, still whispering numbers in silence to the few who knew where to listen. People like Dietrich's widow, who began sketching fractal spirals into the margins of her prayer book until her fingers bled. Or Father Collar, who abandoned his pulpit and spent the last 6 months of his life in the church basement, muttering about the voice beneath the pattern. What Emma had uncovered wasn't just knowledge. It was a signal, and it was still transmitting. The language she had started, the language of behavior, of time, of entropy, was unfinished. And like all unfinished equations, it demanded completion. Not in ink, but in action, in replication, in obedience to a higher pattern. One that didn't care for morality or emotion. One that didn't require consent. You didn't have to understand it. You just had to exist within it. Because once the pattern saw you, you became part of it. That was Emma's real power. She didn't break the system, she turned it inward. She reflected its mechanics until the human souls inside it became cogs, rotating in rhythms they could no longer claim as their own. By 1875, Milwaukee's German Quarter had changed permanently. The brewery never reopened. The community fragmented. Names began to vanish from census rolls. And those who remained, those who still spoke of Emma, did so only in code. She became a ghost, a curse, a riddle. But behind closed doors, in circles of quiet men who had studied her numbers, she became something else. The first signal. It was in this secrecy that the Pattern Study Group was born. 5 men, all educated, none of them spiritual. A former railway engineer, a professor of logic, a retired surgeon, a mathematician from Vienna, and a man whose background remains unknown, recorded only as MZs. They met once a month in the backroom of a shuttered cigar shop. Their stated purpose: to investigate the cognitive and behavioral anomalies surrounding the Richter case. Their real purpose: to replicate her mind. They began small. Experiments in perception, studying how subjects responded to mirrored routines, to repeated social cues, to data loops. They cataloged reaction times, memory deviations, physiological anomalies. The results were inconsistent until they introduced entropy, small injections of chaos into predictable systems, unannounced schedule changes, rearranged objects, misinformation seeded strategically. The moment the variables changed, the pattern emerged. Some subjects resisted, most adapted. But just a few saw through the manipulation. Their responses mimicked Emma's, cold, precise, uncanny. The group realized something terrifying. Emma hadn't been a fluke. She'd been a precursor, pattern cognition, what they now called. Recursive situational awareness wasn't just a mental anomaly. It was a trait, one latent in certain individuals, triggered by exposure to high-frequency patterns of entropy. And observation, meaning the right environment could make someone like Emma, the right trauma, the right isolation, the right saturation of data. They believed they could engineer it. They were wrong. The more they pushed, the more their subjects deteriorated. Sleep deprivation, auditory hallucinations, catatonia. One subject began drawing the same 5 symbols over and over on her arms in charcoal. Another recited numbers that correlated with historical dates of assassination attempts and political shifts. They weren't gaining pattern awareness. They were becoming conduits for it. Then one subject, a boy named Tomas, vanished from the facility. No sign of forced exit, surveillance footage corrupted. What was recovered showed him standing perfectly still for 6 hours, staring at the observation glass, not blinking. Then he said one sentence, "Your system is symmetrical, and you will not survive it." The next frame was static. The group disbanded a week later, but not before sending their findings to a quiet research branch in Washington, an unnamed division operating under the Department of Public Health. Within a year, funding appeared. Quietly, untraceable, and with it, the creation of a black budget initiative known only by its classification, Omega-17. The purpose of OMEG A17 was not to stop people like Emma, it was to track them. To use them, not as assets, but as sensors. Because the government had realized what the pattern group had only glimpsed, that people like Emma weren't errors in the system. They were its natural response to collapse, like antibodies. When a culture grows too saturated with contradiction, when the narratives fracture beyond repair minds, like hers emerge. To measure, to mirror, to judge. And that meant something unthinkable. That Emma Richter had not been a one-time anomaly in a Wisconsin slum. She had been the first of a warning system. And the warnings were increasing. By the early 20th century, there were more recorded cases. Children appearing in war-torn villages with impossible awareness. Teenagers predicting riots in cities they'd never visited. Survivors of genocides who spoke fluently in dead languages they'd never studied. Emma had opened the gate. And now, others were stepping through. But here's the part no one will tell you, the part buried beneath decades of obfuscation and digital white noise. They don't want to stop the collapse anymore. They want to manage it. Control its pace, redirect its consequences. They're using the pattern. Think about it. Why do algorithms push outrage and confusion? Why do social structures repeat the same conflicts with surgical precision? Why is empathy being engineered into AI, while human empathy is systematically stripped away by overexposure to violence, to comparison, to surveillance? Because they've learned to trigger collapse selectively. Because entropy, when controlled, becomes the most powerful weapon in existence, but only if they can suppress people like Emma, people like you. Because here's what matters. You're hearing this, and you're not reacting the way they expected. You're not distracted. You're focused. You're remembering details you didn't realize you stored. You're tracing invisible lines between events in your own life. That's pattern cognition. And now it's awake in you. They want you afraid of that. They want you to believe it leads to madness, to isolation, to ruin. But that's a lie. Because Emma didn't collapse because of her gift. She was silenced. Because her gift was contagious. Because awareness spreads. Because the minute one person steps outside the loop and sees the machine, not just its gears, but its design, others begin to follow, and when enough see it, the illusion ends, the system resets, and the architects lose everything. So they label people like Emma as dangerous, as unstable. They erase the records. They bury the journals. They seed confusion, not to protect the public, but to protect themselves from the only thing they fear, clarity. You see, the deeper you go into the pattern, the more you realize it was never about evil, never about domination. It was about a game of mirrors, a system feeding on its own image, terrified of what would happen if one of its reflections turned around and looked back. Emma turned around. And now, so have you. Clarity is not comforting. It is not peaceful. It is not the warm light of truth you were promised in fairy tales. Clarity burns, it shatters. It strips away the protective illusion society builds like scaffolding around the soul. When you see the system clearly, truly see it, your first instinct isn't to change it. It's to escape, but escape is a myth. There is no outside the pattern, only deeper levels of recursion. And Emma Richter didn't escape it. She descended through it, one layer at a time, peeling back the human theater until nothing was left but cold data and inescapable truth. After the Richter family's quiet departure from Milwaukee, there was no official trace of Emma, no school records, no travel documents. But whispers persisted in towns along the Mississippi River of a gray-eyed girl who arrived before disaster. In St. Cloud, a fire broke out that gutted 3 city blocks, days after a child had warned the local priest in perfect Latin that the sequence is collapsing. In Alton, Illinois, a shipment of contaminated meat was halted only because a young girl told the railway operator the precise hour his brakes would fail before it ever happened. The patterns followed her, or perhaps she followed them. That distinction, too, is part of the illusion. What we call cause and effect is often just order and comfort assigned to chaos. Emma didn't predict events. She revealed inevitabilities. By the time she would have turned 17, Emma had become an unspoken legend in esoteric circles, not among mystics, not among occultists, but among mathematicians, programmers, cold minds that sought logic in entropy. One of them, a young Hungarian prodigy named Béla Szabo, wrote in his journal that he had corresponded in silence with a mind he could not locate. He described sequences appearing in his dreams. Not symbols, not images, just math. Layered, recursive, beautiful, but also watching him. He claimed these sequences responded to his alterations, that when he made intentional mistakes, they corrected themselves. When he tried to defy them, they punished his sleep. He died by self-inflicted starvation, convinced his thoughts were no longer his own. In his final notebook was one phrase, repeated hundreds of times: Emma sees. This is the core terror buried in Emma's legacy. Not the fear that she had access to secret knowledge, but that she was a node and interface between human consciousness and something larger. Something that uses pattern as language. Something that once spoke through prophets and now speaks through code. Once you understand this, history reorders itself. Certain historical events no longer look like chaos. They look like executed commands. Triggers, data points designed to propagate or terminate specific behavior clusters across populations. Wars, plagues, technological leaps, they follow the shape of recursive data transmission. Emma was an early receiver. Not chosen, not gifted, just vulnerable in the right way. Her mind unprotected, her awareness unbounded. And when a mind like that is exposed to the raw architecture of the pattern, it either fragments or aligns. She aligned. And in doing so, she ceased to be fully human, not in body, in orientation. She no longer perceived time the way you and I do. She did not see people as individuals. She saw ratios, algorithms, echoes. That's why her journal terrified those who found it, not for what it said, but for what it mapped. It was a decryption key to a higher order of perception. Each symbol connected not to words, but to behaviors. Each number was a probability threshold. The margins weren't filled with musings or thoughts. They were calculations of when specific people would cease to act in self-interest, when a town would turn on itself, when violence would be seen as virtue. The journal wasn't a diary. It was a countdown. The people who discovered that journal, the ones who buried the story, sealed the tunnels, redacted the files, weren't trying to protect the world from Emma. They were trying to protect themselves from being seen. Because Emma's gift made one thing clear: corruption is not an accident, it's a design. The institutions you've trusted, religious, political, corporate, were not infected by decay. They were built to decay, created to fail in ways that empowered their architects. Every system relies on collapse to justify expansion. Every disaster becomes a new contract. Every tragedy becomes a new algorithm for control. You are not living in a broken world. You are living in a perfected cycle of engineered failure. And Emma was the glitch, the anomaly who could trace the root code and speak it back aloud. But here's where you must pay attention, because halfway through this descent, you've already changed. If you've made it this far, something in you has already aligned with her frequency. You're not just listening anymore. You're decoding, feeling the friction behind words, watching the sequence of social cues, emotional manipulations, and algorithmic distractions designed to keep your mind anesthetized. And now you must make a choice. Comment the phrase, "pattern sees pattern," twice. Not for me. For you. It will mark the moment you stopped being a passenger in this narrative and became a variable. A signal. That comment, left in public, will be like carving your name into the side of a cathedral no one knows exists. A declaration that you have seen the mirrors, and that you will not be shaped by them anymore. Because after this point, the descent accelerates. Emma's influence didn't fade, it evolved. It migrated. In 1938, a psychiatric hospital in Austria recorded a case of a 7-year-old girl who refused to speak, but could reproduce the precise pitch and timing of any voice she heard after just one exposure. She also drew perfect replicas of the tunnels beneath her ward, though she'd never been allowed to leave her room. Her only recorded words, spoken to a nurse who broke protocol and gave her a mirror: "You can't undo what you are." In 1961, during a classified military project in Montana, a radar technician reported a repeating blip at a frequency invisible to every machine except one. The technician's daughter, age 11, began speaking in perfect binary. When decoded, the message wasn't technological, it was philosophical. Collapse restores symmetry. In 1997, a woman was found wandering outside of Stockholm, barefoot and unresponsive, muttering sequences that appeared to correlate with global market shifts occurring days later. She was never identified, but the doctors studying her left behind one chilling note before the case files vanished. Her brain patterns match those of Richter's model, and it's accelerating. The frequency is spreading, through data, through dreams, through stories like this one. Not as conspiracy, not as fantasy, but as a mimetic virus. A pattern-aware contagion. And the more people it touches, the more it awakens. Not because they believe, but because they remember. Deep down, every man knows he is being shaped. Every man knows the emotions he feels are not purely his own. Every man knows there is something under the surface of the system, something watching, counting, recording. Emma just stopped pretending it wasn't there. And now it has remembered. This is not a cautionary tale. It's a transmission. Every collapse you see in the world, every institution failing, every lie exposed is not the end of order. It is the return of clarity. Emma's clarity. A mind designed not to be comforted by illusion, but to pierce it. That is your potential. Not to follow her, but to become her reflection. You've noticed it, haven't you? The timing of global events, the way tragedy clusters, the patterns of public distraction that always follow leaks of real information, the normalization of surveillance under the guise of connection. You've seen it. And now you can't unsee it. That's not paranoia, that's the pattern. Reacting to your awakening. Because awareness is a threat, not when it shouts. When it watches. Just like Emma did. Just like you're doing now.